The kitchen light is the only thing on in the house. It's almost midnight. A teenager stands there quietly eating cereal straight from the box, scrolling their phone, while across the room, their Gen X parent is hunched over a laptop, finishing work emails they said they'd stop an hour ago. Neither of them is upset, neither is exactly relaxed either. Every now and then they exchange a small smile, like, "We good?" And somehow, that's enough.
That moment right there captures something fascinating about the psychology of Gen X parents. People often assume they're emotionally distant, overly practical, or just permanently tired. But the deeper reality is more complex. Gen X parents grew up in a unique cultural gap. Less supervised than boomers, less openly expressive than millennials, and that experience shaped how they show love, set boundaries, and handle stress. If you've ever wondered why your Gen X parent says, "text me when you get there" instead of "I love you," or why you, as a Gen X parent, sometimes struggle between independence and closeness, there's psychology behind that.
Picture another scene. It's the early evening. Driveway still warm from the sun. A Gen X dad sits in his parked car for a few extra minutes before going inside. Not because he doesn't love his family, because he needs a quiet buffer, a mental loading screen. Work stress fading out, parenting mode fading in. That pause, that emotional self-management, often comes from what psychologists call defensive pessimism. It's a coping strategy where people mentally prepare for challenges by anticipating problems rather than assuming everything will go smoothly. Many Gen Xers grew up during economic uncertainty, rising divorce rates, and rapid technological change. Expecting things to go wrong wasn't negativity, it was survival training. And here's the twist. Defensive pessimism can actually make someone a very dependable parent. They double-check plans. They save money just in case. They teach their kids resilience without necessarily giving long motivational speeches. But socially, it can also create misunderstandings. Kids might interpret that cautious energy as emotional distance. Friends might see them as skeptical or overly practical. Then those reactions reinforce the Gen X parent's instinct to stay guarded. Behavior creates reaction, reaction strengthens behavior. A quiet psychological loop. Now imagine Saturday afternoon at a crowded mall. A Gen X mom watches her child try on sneakers while casually mentioning how expensive things are these days. Not guilt-tripping, just narrating reality. That comes partly from social comparison theory, the idea that we measure ourselves against others to understand our own standing. Gen X grew up watching both conspicuous wealth in media and real financial strain at home. That tension often leads to balanced parenting, encouraging ambition while emphasizing practicality. Dream big but pack a lunch, basically. Sometimes this produces wonderfully grounded kids. Other times it accidentally teaches anxiety about money or success. Again, not intentional, just psychological inheritance. Speaking of inheritance, let me tell you about another scene. A Gen X parent standing at a school play, filming proudly but not rushing backstage afterward. There's love, clearly, but there's also restraint. That often traces back to attachment theory, which explores how early relationships shape emotional expression. Many Gen Xers were what researchers sometimes call the latchkey generation, kids who came home to empty houses, microwaved snacks, and notes on the fridge. They learned independence early. Self-soothing became second nature. That independence is a strength. Gen X parents tend to raise capable kids who can solve problems, but emotional expression sometimes feels unfamiliar terrain. Not because they don't feel deeply, they do, but because their internal blueprint says, handle it yourself first. Partners, kids, even coworkers can misread that as detachment, creating another subtle relational loop. Here's a smaller, quieter moment. A Gen X parent fixing something around the house late at night. Loose cabinet hinge, flickering bulb, software update on the family laptop. Nobody asked, nobody may even notice. But for many Gen X parents, love often translates into practical action. Psychologists sometimes call this intergenerational transmission of parenting style. We unconsciously repeat patterns we experienced, sometimes improving them, sometimes simply continuing them. If your own parents showed care through provision rather than conversation, you might instinctively do the same. And honestly, there's something beautifully steady about that. Reliability can be a form of emotional safety.
But let's not romanticize everything. There's another scene you might recognize. A Gen X parent scrolling news late at night, sighing quietly. Global uncertainty, economic pressure, aging parents, kids growing up fast. This generation often carries what psychologists describe as the sandwich generation stress, caring for both children and aging parents simultaneously. Chronic low-level stress affects mood, patience, even communication style. That's neuroscience, not personality failure. When cortisol stays slightly elevated over long periods, emotional bandwidth shrinks. Conversations get shorter. Energy conservation becomes the priority.
Yet here's where it gets interesting. Research shows moderate stress exposure earlier in life can build resilience later. Many Gen X parents are remarkably adaptable. They lived through analog childhoods, digital adulthood, shifting job markets, evolving social norms. That adaptability often becomes one of their greatest parenting gifts. They may not always verbalize empathy, but they model endurance. Think about family vacations for a second. A Gen X parent triple checks directions, snacks, emergency contacts. Meanwhile, their kid just wants vibes and playlists. That difference isn't generational stubbornness. It's psychological risk calibration, shaped by earlier uncertainty. And there's humor in all this too. The classic Gen X sarcasm. Slightly dry, slightly self-deprecating. Humor, psychologists say, is a mature defense mechanism. It diffuses tension without denying reality. If your parent jokes instead of delivering heartfelt monologues, that might actually be emotional intelligence in disguise. Now circle back to relationships. Romantic partners of Gen X parents often describe them as steady, but sometimes emotionally reserved. Friendships with them can feel low maintenance. Months without talking, then instant reconnection. That reflects early independence again. Closeness without constant contact feels normal to them, but younger generations raised with continuous digital connection might interpret that differently. And here's an unexpected strength. Because Gen X parents value autonomy, they often respect their kids' individuality more than previous generations did. They're less likely to micromanage identity choices, career paths, or hobbies. Figure it out, I'm here if you need me, becomes their quiet parenting philosophy. Let me bring you into one more small scene. A Gen X parent teaching their teenager to cook. No big lecture, just side-by-side chopping vegetables, casual conversations slipping in between practical instructions. Emotional connection through shared activity. For many in this generation, doing something together feels safer than sitting down for an intense emotional talk. It lowers vulnerability while still building closeness.
And if you are a Gen X parent watching this, maybe you recognize the constant balancing act. Independence versus connection, realism versus optimism, protection versus freedom. That tension isn't failure. It's actually a sophisticated psychological adaptation to the era you grew up in. Remember that midnight kitchen scene we started with? The cereal, the laptop glow, the quiet companionship? Here's the deeper truth behind it. Gen X parenting often expresses love through presence without pressure. Not hovering, not abandoning. Just there.
So if you're trying to understand a Gen X parent, or understand yourself as one, maybe the core pattern can be summed simply. They learned early that stability isn't always guaranteed, so they became the kind of adults who quietly create it for others. And maybe instead of asking, why aren't they more expressive, you could ask, where are they already showing up in ways I might overlook? Sometimes it's in repaired appliances, paid bills, late-night rides, or that simple text asking if you got home safe. If you are that parent, it might be worth wondering gently whether independence always has to mean emotional self-containment. Connection doesn't erase strength, it often amplifies it. And if you're the kid or partner, consider how acknowledging those quiet acts of care might open conversations that never quite started before. Back in that kitchen, imagine the parent finally closing the laptop, grabbing a handful of cereal too, standing beside their kid instead of across the room. No dramatic speech, just shared space. Sometimes that's how bridges form,
not with grand gestures, but with small moments repeated over time. And honestly, that might be the most Gen X thing of all. Quiet resilience, practical love, a steady presence that doesn't always announce itself, but rarely disappears. If any of this feels familiar, whether you grew up with Gen X parents or you are one, I'd love to hear your experiences. These generational stories are still unfolding, and understanding them together makes the journey a little less solitary. And if this kind of psychological deep dive resonates with you, stick around. There's always more beneath the surface than we first notice.